When we approach our lines, one of the most difficult things that I would suggest we need to do is to juggle multiple concepts at the same time. When we come to a history like 2014 to 2019, everything can become confusing if we just look at it from one direction. We need to try and practice looking at these things from multiple directions. What I mean by that is when we think about the line of the 144,000, it begins in 1989, and prior to that you have this 10-year history of the moral majority. And then we arrive at the time of the end. And we know that this is our overarching line, it's our template from which we take our fractals. We come down to 2014, to 2019, we don't see this one on the line of 144,000, so I'll just note that it's in here. But we have this overarching line of 144,000, and it shows how our reform line begins. On the line of Acts 27, you come to 1989 and you have two presidents, Reagan and Bush. And the moral majority was instrumental in the election of both presidents. So we can see on the line of the 144,000, when we come to this history, we have the rise of Jerry Falwell, this attempt to make America great again, restore its morality through the action of the political system. And then as we trace the reform line of the 144,000 through Raffia, Panium, Sunday law, close of probation, Second Advent, it's all just one history of progression, the result of the moral majority and the election of Ronald Reagan. Is that clear? Moral majority, backlash to the civil rights movement, issues of equality, they get Reagan elected, and then George Bush. 2014 isn't even really on this reform line, and it's just progression from then on in. But we have another way to look at this. We come to the line of the world, and it shows us a more complicated picture. That we can see this waymark that doesn't exist here, 2014 to 2019, and all of a sudden 2014 is the time of the end. And what happens in this history? You have Jerry Falwell, Jr., you have their own form of moral majority, and here they are able to see Reagan elected and then George Bush elected, whereas in this history, it's the rise of Donald Trump. Prior to 1979, 1989, prior to the election of Reagan, they had presidents who were really quite liberal. I think Jimmy Carter comes to mind. And really, they were quite progressive in their policies. So this election of Reagan is a backlash against progressive presidents. We come into our reform line where on the line of the 144,000, we just see the United States downhill all this time. Acts 27, the ship from the time of the end when they go on a voyage they weren't meant to go on to when the storm strikes, they're just a mess all the way till shipwreck. Then we zoom in, and it's a lot like looking at stars in the night sky. If you were to stand and just look with your naked eye, you might look at a bright star and think it's just this one star. And then you zoom in and you see that in fact it's a galaxy and it's composed of many stars, and you zoom in some more and you see hundreds, if not thousands of stars. So it's the same thing with our reform line. We can zoom right out and see this ship from the very beginning. The combination of church and state, the introduction of conservative presidents working with the church system, backlash against progressive presidents, and then it all just goes downhill all the way through the Sunday law. We zoom in and we see that the story is more complicated. Prior to 2014, you have progressive presidents, namely Barack Obama. There's a backlash to Barack Obama, and we see the election of Donald Trump through again Jerry Falwell Jr. and his own form of the moral majority. A collection of evangelical leaders. So it becomes really important, and I don't think that we realize how important, not just in understanding this, but in also understanding our primary waymarks, that we can conceptualize them in these different ways. So when we come to this history of 14 to 19, we've tried to incorporate some of that. And that's an explanation of why we see Michael Moore, does formalize their message in 2018. So you can see him, you can introduce him to this story as if the time of the end was 2014, and then he's going to have an increase of knowledge and formulate a message known as Fahrenheit 11.9. But that isn't our only narrative. We also have the 144,000. And we're using the priesthood line here when we look at 14 to 19. And we see that in that ploughing, that early history and ploughing history of the priests, 144,000, we already have to place Michael Moore and his ascendancy, because we're working off these two different concepts or reform lines. So when we understand 2014, 2019, the ploughing of the world history, we have to see it in these two different ways. First of all, learning from the preparation and ploughing of the priests, 144,000, and we bring that in and see that they are going to mirror that image. A 10-year history where they're meant to wake up. In 2004 being the release of Fahrenheit 9/11. Our reform lines are simple when we keep each element separate, but when we have to start juggling the different elements, the fact that this is the introduction of Michael Moore, but he's also relevant for the 144,000, then we have to conceptualize multiple elements at the same time. So we're learning from the ploughing of the priests here, or the 144,000. Both have this 10-year history where they're meant to wake up, 79 to 89, moral majority, Afghanistan war, etc. We see then this 10-year history of preparation for the world, 2004 to 2014. And this is where you see massive global change. 2009, the global financial crisis. 2008, 2009 launches the ultra-conservative Tea Party. This Tea Party is a catalyst in the rise of Donald Trump. The next catalyst is Obama's re-election in 2012. You can already see within their 10-year history that they're working off our own waymarks. 2009, 2012 are waymarks in the history of the priests. So even in their 10 years, they're following the same pattern. 2009, 2012, the two catalyst years that bring us to 2014 and the rise of Donald Trump. We looked at the documentary of Frontline, Zero Tolerance, and it shows in Steve Bannon's own words as he takes part in that documentary how, because of the Tea Party movement and then Obama's re-election, he brought together a coalition of Stephen Miller and Jeff Sessions with himself at the Breitbart embassy in Washington, D.C., and they formulated a plan of how they were going to bring in this new government. And when I say new government, it's not just a new president, it's the overthrow of the whole American establishment, as it has been for a couple of hundred years. They decide that the first step is to overthrow the establishment within their own Republican Party, and they begin that work in 2014 with the Speaker of the House, Eric Cantor, losing his election, the first Speaker of the House to lose his own election in the history of the United States. And he does this is because the Republican Party plus Fox News, his own allies, turn on him, and essentially it's the beginning of an internal purge. We understand Adolf Hitler, what did he do when he came to power? Purged his own party. It was known as the Night of Long Knives. He sent out all of these men with, it's called knives, they used guns as well, and assassinated, slaughtered members of his own party, the people that helped bring him to power. Stalin, what did he do when he took power? First step. Hitler is elected comes to power in 1933, yes? Why is he not doing a worldwide work until 1939? Takes him 6 years. What has he got to do? Purge his own country. First his own party, then a dictatorial control over his own party. Stalin comes to power in the early 1920s. Why does he take so long? He's not even fighting Germany until 1941, and Germany is his arch enemy. Why does it take him about 15, 18 years? Because Stalin purged more than anyone. He had hardly a competent general left by the time World War II began. They always begin purging, first of all, the people that got them to power, their own party, and then a nationwide purge. So the first beginning of a dictatorship was this purge in 2014, and it's orchestrated by Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, and Jeff Sessions. And the key issue that they're working off is the issue of immigration. Because Eric Cantor and those swamp-like Republicans, they were mainstream, middle-of-the-road conservatives. They were willing to compromise with Barack Obama on immigration. They needed to get rid of all of them and bring in hardline conservatives. Begins in 2014, 2016, a win with Donald Trump. And what did Steve Bannon say about 2016? This was not an act of man. He says this was an act of God. This was divine providence. He won't even take total personal credit for this. He sees this as the work of God. 2018, there's a formalization. We looked at the Trump prophecy. So we've seen this coming together, this rising of Donald Trump as really the front man of the whole movement. And we see that movement, we've looked at it from two different ways. We've looked at it from the really clearly religious aspect of it, when you see Jerry Falwell, the evangelical leaders, how they came together to see him elected. Then we looked at Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, and their work to get him elected. And we highlighted the point that even though we can talk about the Trump prophecy and Jerry Falwell, and it's so clearly religious, what did we say about Steve Bannon's movement? It's religious. And again, he's a very helpful individual, is Steve Bannon, because you can find so much in his own words. He cannot stay quiet. So we went through some quotes, how he spoke in the Vatican in 2014. He says that godlessness, immorality, has sapped the strength of the Jewish Christian West. So he sees not only secular immorality as the enemy, also Muslim countries as the enemy. We can focus a lot on his beliefs about radical Islam, but it's also secularism that he sees as the enemy. He says that when America was great, he doesn't say those exact words, I'm paraphrasing. When America was great, what it needs to be brought back to was when there was economic prosperity through through capitalism, and those capitalists were strong Christians. They were either strong in the Jewish faith or strong in the Christian faith. So when they need to make America great again, who do they need to bring in? It needs to be connected to this narrative that America is only great as a Jewish Christian nation. He says, there's a crisis, and that crisis is a crisis of faith, a weakening of Jewish Christian ideals, or I would say Jewish Christian beliefs or morality, brought on by the recent popularity of two enemies, secularism and the Muslim world. He says if you look back at the long history of the Jewish Christian West struggle against Islam, I believe that our forefathers kept their stance, and I think they did the right thing. I think they kept it out of the world. So he says they kept Muslims at a distance. They didn't even allow them into their countries. And he says whether it was at Vienna or Tours or other places, whether it was at Vienna, what message does that bring us back to? Someone raise your hand. He says that their forefathers defended the Jewish Christian here, Europe, by keeping the Muslims at bay at Vienna. What is he referring to, my brother? The restraint? What was the second part you said, sorry? In 1529. Restraint of radical Islam at Vienna in 1529. 1529. Why do we talk about 1529? Someone raise your hand. Brother Rogers. The 490 years. It's amazing how much of our message Steve Bannon would be familiar with if he went through this. But he brings up the siege of Vienna as an example of how their forefathers kept the Muslim world at bay. But it's all built on this narrative of protecting America, as he doesn't say this, but you can see through the policies, particularly, I hope everyone has by now looked at Stephen Miller, particularly as keeping America white and Jewish/Christian. So we went through that history, then we went through the history of Michael Moore. We've done that a couple of times. Fahrenheit 9/11, he did Roger and Me, 1989. Fahrenheit 9/11, 2004, explaining 2001 in multiple details. Then 2014, the Flint, Michigan crisis. 2018, September, October, Fahrenheit 11/9, and how closely his message paralleled ours. And I believe in the worship tonight, a sister's going to give us more history of Michael Moore. So we see this as the history of the ploughing of the world. And we come to 2019 and there's a completely polarized United States, and that's really been demonstrated through the litmus test that was the impeachment proceeding. So we finished yesterday by asking a question. This is the ploughing of the world. We come down through the history of their early reign, then the history of their latter reign. We spoke on Sabbath. It was in the question and answer session, and Elder Parminda spoke about 2021. Does everyone remember that? What was said about 2021? Does anyone remember the quote that we went to? Sorry, House Majority Leader, not Speaker. I knew there was a difference. House Majority Leader. Thank you. What quote did we go to in the question and answer session on Sabbath? Does anyone remember? I want to go to 605. I know we might have gone through some of that. Great Controversy 605.3. By the way, my sister at the front, the pink. For the world, what is this waymark? For the world, the Nethinims, what is the waymark of 2021? We understand that on a reform line we have 5 primary waymarks, yes? So we have 2014, 2019, 2021, Sunday law, close of probation. I've just given the Daniel quotes for those 2. So which waymark is 2021 for a Nethinim? Sunday law. So I don't want to confuse it with the quote. I know that GC 605.3, when in those quotes, when it talks about the Sunday law, I know it's speaking of this one. I know that's the one it's speaking about. But I want us to remember that what we call Panium, or 2021, is the Sunday law for the world, yes? So we'll come back to our quote. 605.3. Heretofore, those who presented the truths of the third angel's message have often been regarded as mere alarmists. Their predictions that religious intolerance would gain control in the United States, that church and state would unite to persecute those who keep the commandments of God, have been pronounced groundless and absurd. It has been confidently declared that this land could never become other than it has been, the defender of religious liberty. But as the question of enforcing Sunday observance is widely agitated, the event so long doubted and disbelieved is seen to be approaching, and the third message will produce an effect which it could not have had before. So where did we place this verse, this quote? My sister, where did we place this quote? When it talks about, in that last part, but as the question of enforcing Sunday observance is widely agitated, the event so long doubted and disbelieved is seen to be approaching. What is that event? The question of enforcing Sunday observance is agitated, and the event doubted and disbelieved is approaching. Sorry? It's before Sunday law. Are you happy that the event is Sunday law? So the event is approaching, Sunday law is approaching. So where would you place this quote on our reform line? (2021), I would do the same. Here we placed the agitation of the Sunday law. Do we all remember that? The Sunday law is seen approaching, yes? Before the event that people said would never happen, before it approaches, there's an agitation of the subject, yes? So when we take this and when we see a waymark approaching, where are we? How much light are we given in advance? We have to be walking over the ground, yes? So if we see it approaching, can you see it if it's back here and this is blocking your view? No, this is agitation for the world. It has to be in front of them. So we would place the agitation at what we call Panium, or 2021. We're all okay with that. The agitation prior to the Sunday law. Then we ask the question, what then do we do for them in their history of the harvest? We've seen the history of their ploughing. We've seen this polarising message between two groups, those who believe Trump is Hitler and those who believe he is Cyrus. We come down to their harvest and the cries pronounced, "Come out of her, my people," progressively from the Sunday law to the loud cry, and I asked, what kind of message are we giving these people, and what did you all say? What were the answers? If you want to give one, raise your hand. My brother? So we're going to give them a Bible-based message. I'm going to say prophecy, Bible message. Anyone else?
A prophetic message that is connected to external events.
So it's prophetic, but it's about external events. Anyone else? My brother? Bible message? Anyone else want to add? Thought of what type of message, my brother?
I want to understand the difference between those 2 points.
I'll remove prophecy. I would say this one is, because I put that word in, this one is connected to external events, this one isn't. Any other thoughts, my sister?
External events in the Bible, like this one. Not prophetic, external events.
If we're explaining external events, don't we do that prophetically? So are you agreeing with this one, or do you want to put another one up?
It's like prophetic is the same as Bible message, right?
I'll differentiate them. I'll do 2. So this is a purely internal biblical message. Biblical only. Not connected to the external events. This one is prophetic, explaining the external events. World War I, World War II, World War III. And you want to put one in that you're focusing that this is prophetic, connected to inspiration. No?
Some events to be prophecy.
So prophetic, inspired prophetic, so it's a connection between the biblical and the prophetic explaining external events. Okay with that? Do any of these require people to keep something that we could or would term morality? A bad term for it. Does anyone say yes? So when we take this message, are we going to be telling people, you need to dress modestly, you need to remove your jewellery, you need to be vegan? Are we going to tell people any of that? So someone says, no other requirement. All they have to do is accept this one external message. That's it. We bring to them no message about diet reform, health reform.
I would have a different opinion. So I would go with this logic that there is a principle in what gives us of the present truth, but I would also argue they are precious truths. So in the need we always claim to study the present truth, we are also not limited to study the precious truths. So we say such things like morality or grace and this. So they will have to learn those from us as precious truths, but not present truth.
So one brother says no requirement except the testing present truth message of their dispensation, and another brother says all truths. They're required to take everything that we have. Yes,
There's one thing that I don't really understand. When we talk about biblical message, do we talk about when we don't teach people heaven form, don't teach them moral life? Does it mean that we're not giving the Bible?
My understanding, when people talked about a biblical message, they're talking about their specific testing message for their dispensation. Not going to the Bible and showing them quotes about diet or jewelry or anything like that. Biblical only, related to the one test. That's my understanding of what people meant when they said biblical. A biblical message relating to the harvest test of their dispensation. My brother.
Since some days ago we learned from the propaganda that we please and all our understanding.
I don't want to go into explanations. I just want people's points, what they believe, and then we'll go through our explanations. Do you agree with one of these? Which one?
All truths are required for them.
Sorry?
All truths.
All truths required. Plus a testing message. Anyone else?
So,
Are you going to give us a new one?
I said yesterday biblical message. That's why I was trying to know.
Biblical message,
Yeah,
one test.
yeah, which is one test. Because I believe we are not going to stand for the one and say
I
that.
don't want explanation. We're just doing our points. Otherwise, we'll just spend class after class debating it between ourselves. Yes, my brother.
I want to suggest that when God is giving a message, does not mean that He's not making another thing.
So, adding to these,
Yes, exactly. What I'm saying,
what one would you like to add?
I will not have that on top of the brother who says it's a perfect message.
Prophetic message. So this one, prophetic to external events. Anyone else? Is there one of these that you don't believe in or you don't believe with any of these? Do you want to add one? Sister Snyder. Sorry? All truths required plus a test for their dispensation. So this one says biblical only, but this biblical message relates directly and specifically to the test of their dispensation. So if we were to have to speak to them about equality, for instance, we're going to go through inspiration to prove equality. This one is a prophetic message. World War I, World War II, explaining external events. Really the difference I want us to see is related to what we're bringing them. Are we bringing them just some type of external message like, you don't have to be Christian, you don't need to keep the Sabbath, you don't need to change your diet or any of your practices, just accept this one test. Whatever is your testing message here, that's all you need. Because some people, not meaning to speak badly of them, I don't mean this in a bad way, people are generally, I think even every one of us, even the ones of you that I agree with, mostly are confused over this. So this is how confused people have become, where we have such different narratives among ourselves of what this history looks like. So we want to come into some type of unity as much as we can about what the lines teach us regarding this history. Are people required to accept all the truths that we understand, whether they relate to Sabbath or diet or dress, plus the testing message of their harvest? Or do we give no other requirement than their one testing message? This is specifically what's dividing people. Then I asked a second question. We're divided into two groups, yes? The world is divided into two groups, and I asked people to give their idea, their summary in a couple of words of what those two groups are. And someone said conservative versus liberal. Does anyone want to give a different one? Sister Jennifer. Sorry? Wheat and tares? I would agree with that. We know that we can build that model. Any other idea about this division? Anyone else? Do we all agree with this? Does anyone not agree? So I'm going to say that we all agree on this point, conservative versus liberal. We're taking that because we're looking back at the ploughing history and seeing the split that's happening within America. Is that right? That's where we're taking that from. So I want to leave this study for the moment. Come back to something that we did on Sabbath. This won't look directly related to begin with, but it is related. Not this last Sabbath, the Sabbath before, when most of you hadn't yet arrived. So some of you were here and you may remember that. We talked about ancient Israel. So if we were to speak about ancient Israel, and I'm not dividing into Alpha and Omega, I'm just speaking generally. This is ancient Israel. What type of government did God require them to have? Sister Dorcas, what type of government did ancient Israel have? Sorry, I can't quite hear you. The fan is right here. So you're talking about the prophets and the judges, then into the kings. We know that they had some trouble with the kings, but I would say the same type of government continued. When we discuss ancient Israel, we're talking about the glorious land, yes? So this is the original glorious land, and where's Alpha glorious land? What's the Omega glorious land? The United States. So are we familiar with the first, I can't remember my terms. When it comes to the government of the United States, it rises up in 1798 and has two horns like a lamb. What are those two horns? The two horns of the lamb-like beast. Republicanism and Protestantism. Were those horns allowed to touch? No. So they're separated. So we know that the Omega glorious land, the United States, what's their behaviour towards church and state? Separate. So coming back to Sister Dorcas, Alpha glorious land, what type of government do they have? Because you know Omega glorious land separates church from state. And in ancient Israel, Sorry? So, when they're led by God, how, if you just think of one man, Samuel, what kind of power did Samuel have? What kind of power did Samuel have? Religious or political? Religious? So when they're going to war, is it purely religious? He has political. So can you see how one man, just in Samuel, he was both head of their religion and also of their government. So ancient Israel, it's an incorporation of church and state. Are you okay with that? We can see that neatly with Samuel because it talks about how he ruled and judged Israel. But we also know that his title is religious. So ancient Israel is this combination of church and state in one person. We can see that. Gets a little bit more complicated once they come down to the kings. But when David commits adultery, what happens to him? He's judged, isn't he? So if David commits adultery, he's judged. Is the United States being judged because Trump committed adultery? No, why? Someone raise your hand. David's judged because he committed adultery. Trump isn't judged because he committed adultery. Brother Rogers. So even when they had kings, they're still a theocracy. They're still controlled by the dictates of God's requirements. Even under kings. So that the type of government that incorporates the religious and political, you would call a theocracy. Ancient Israel, Alpha glorious land, a combination of church and state. Omega glorious land, church and state separated. So what methodology do you have to use? No, you do not use compare and contrast. If you used compare and contrast, what would you say? Glorious land, church, state, union. United States, glorious land, church, state, union. That's the methodology the religious right are using. What methodology do we have to use? Dispensationalism. Otherwise, we'll side with Ben Carson. Do we all know who Ben Carson is? Who says that church and state separation doesn't mean that the two can't work together. So at the beginning, they are a church-state union. We're going to use Samuel as an example of that. It's church plus state. Until when? When does all of that come to an end? When does God do away with that? My brother, you were here that Sabbath. I shouldn't ask you. Who wasn't here last Sabbath? I'll get back to you. Sister Joy, you weren't here that Sabbath. When did this theocracy end? Which scattering? We know they've been in captivity to Babylon. They come out of that. They go into captivity to Rome. But to be God's denominated people, this is what they expect. Where would you place the end of that?
After they're scattered into Babylon, and they come and are home.
After they come out from Babylon, what do? They rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and they set up a government, don't they? So I would suggest that they're still under this type of model, even through captivity, as they come out of captivity. So they attempt to restart this, then they go into captivity to Rome. What do the Pharisees expect to happen? So they can go back to a theocratic government. That's kind of a reasonable expectation, isn't it? When we place ourselves in their shoes and we look at what they've had for how many hundreds of years, becomes really reasonable that they would expect that when a deliverer is raised up, they're going to be able to return to a theocracy, which is state power and religious power. Becomes a reasonable expectation. So, Sister Joy, I don't agree with it being Babylon. Do you still say that? Do you want to give another alternative? Okay. Were you here that Sabbath?
I was thinking it ends in the line of Christ.
Line of Christ? So the Pharisees are expecting a return to theocracy. John is expecting a return to theocracy. What does Christ give them?
So when Christ comes, he does not give them the version they expect. Christ is about to divide the two now, when he's going to set a spiritual kingdom. So today I would give the argument that it's the history of ancient Israel, it's the kingdom of Israel that had that theocratic. It is in the line of Christ, it is the Omega, that we see the end of that reform line. So when we enter into the other reform line, like the Millerite history, which is our alpha modern, God has already set up principles of a different mode of church and state.
So if we were to say the history of Christ, does everyone agree with that? Or does anyone disagree?
That's the one.
The point in time when they go from this theocratic model of ancient Israel to the early church, which is not a combination of church and state. Ancient Israel, from the history of Moses all the way through until the history of Christ and the early church, is a combination of church and state. When Jesus comes and sets up his disciples, the Jewish leadership's passed by, the 490 ends, God's people have gone from a theocracy, church and state, to just church power, yes? Does anyone disagree with that? Sister Joy, are you okay with that? Does that make sense? So I would agree with that model, that they are a theocracy, church, state combination through the history of ancient Israel, from Moses to the time of Christ, recognizing their periods of captivity. When we go to the model of Daniel 2, it compares and contrasts two kingdoms, yes? Two kingdoms or churches. And what are they? You have God's, the mountain, and Satan's. What is Satan's? The image. And what is this image composed of? My sister in the blue. What is this image composed of? Sorry? This image of the statue in Daniel chapter 2. What is it composed of? You don't have to give the kingdoms. If you were to go to Daniel 11, what does it call these? The image. This is Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. If you were to go to Daniel chapter 11, won't really talk about Babylon, but it's there. Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. What does it call them all? My sister in the blue. talks about Alexander the Great. He's overthrown, it's divided into the four winds of heaven until you have two. Seleucus and Ptolemy. What term does it give for Seleucus? We can go to the chapter if you want to turn to it. Verse 5 and 6 is the introduction to these two kingdoms, Seleucus and Ptolemy. Lysimachus and Cassander have been done away with. So it talks about Seleucus and Ptolemy, and it doesn't name the individuals, it refers to them as under two different titles. What are those two different titles? If you were to go to verse 5 and verse 6. In verse 5, it's talking about Ptolemy in Egypt, and what does it? It doesn't say Ptolemy or Egypt. How does it describe him? Daniel 11:5. Sorry, I jumped from 2 to 11, so I'm probably confused. The king of the south. So Ptolemy down in Egypt is the king of the south, and who is Seleucus? The king of the north. So when we talk about the statue of Daniel 2, it takes us through Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece and Rome. But prophetically, how do we define those kingdoms? What are each of these? Rome, Greece, Medo Persia, Babylon. They all come under the title of the kings of the north. Just looking for a passage. Jeremiah 1:15. Jeremiah 1:15. Jeremiah 1:15 says, I'll start in verse 13. Starting verse 13. And the word of the Lord came unto me the second time, saying, What seest thou? And I said, I see a seething pot, and the face thereof is toward the north. Then the Lord said unto me, Out of the north an evil shall break forth upon all the inhabitants of the land. For lo, I will call all the families of the kingdoms of the north, saith the Lord, and they shall come. And they shall set every one his throne at the entering of the gates of Jerusalem, and against all the walls thereof round about, and against all the cities of Judah. So when God is going to judge his people, who does he bring against them? King of the north, except here, and it doesn't say king or kingdom, it says kingdoms, plural. Can we see that? So it says, God will call all the families of the kingdoms of the north, and they shall come, one after the other. Babylon came, Medo Persia came, Greece came, Rome came. We go back, another witness, Revelation chapter 17. Revelation 17:3. He sees a picture, a woman riding a scarlet-coloured beast, that beast having 7 heads and 10 horns. Someone who was not here that Sabbath. What do the 7 heads represent? The woman is riding the beast. What is that picture of? What's that a symbol of? My sister. Woman riding the beast. What do we take from that? In the purple. What does a woman represent? So what parable do we take from that picture? About the relationship. And who has the reins? The woman. So is this a church-state relationship? And who's in power? The church. That is the model of the King of the North, yes? Church over state. So we're seeing in the description of the picture here, the woman riding the beast, a woman in Bible prophecy representing church, and a beast representing state. The church in control over the state. This is a church-state relationship. So when we come and look at this beast, what are the 7 heads? My sister, what are the 7 heads? Kingdoms? Which kingdoms? Don't need to name all of them, just give me the concept. Kingdoms of Bible prophecy? Are you seeing that as Europe or as Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, Rome? Because people would go to this verse and have 2 different stories. One would say this is all the kings of Europe, and one would see that those 7 heads are the 7 kingdoms of Bible prophecy, starting with Babylon. Which one do you see it as? Can you say that a little louder, sorry? Kingdoms of Bible prophecy. I don't want to do a study on Revelation 17, but that's the point that I agree with and I want us to recognize. We're having a photographic flash of this woman in the history of 1798. Her cup is full, but this is Satan's church since the very beginning. This is the King of the North, or the church-state relationship from the history of Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, pagan Rome, papal Rome, all through that history. The beast has 7 heads. The kingdoms of Bible prophecy all the way from back here. So if we take that picture and see that this woman is controlling the 7 kingdoms of Bible prophecy, all of those kingdoms are the King of the North, then all of these kingdoms, starting in Babylon and Medo Persia, Greece and Rome, must be a church-state relationship with the church in control of the state. Does that make sense? So come down to Medo Persia. Who controls Medo Persia? Sister Sarah. Who controls Medo Persia? Just broadly. Church or state? Does the church control Medo Persia? Does their religion control it? Or is it controlled by state power? Sorry? So we're taking these kingdoms. Option 1, some people say state. My sister in the back. What do you say? I'm looking at you. You don't have to turn around. Who controls Medo Persia? How is it controlled? Through the church or through the state? You say church? So someone says church? What about you, my sister? Church or state? Who controls Medo Persia? You say it's the church? Controls Medo Persia? Sister Dorcas, what do you say? Who controls Medo Persia? Church or state? The nation of Medo Persia. Who's really in control of it? Sorry? Both. Both? So Sister Dorcas is saying both. Some say state, some say church, and our sister says both. Turn to the story of Daniel chapter 6. Sister Dorcas, can you give us a brief summary of the Daniel chapter 6? In a few words, narrate this story for us. I can't quite hear you, sorry. Speak loud. And then we come into verse 5, and you have all of these government officials, and they're angry at Daniel, and they want to trip him, yes? So what are they going to do? And they take that to Darius, and he signs it into law, yes? Then he finds out that it's his favourite who's broken that law. And then what does Darius want to do? The king signs a law that says you're not allowed to make a request of any god, only to me. And then he sees that his favourite, Daniel, has broken that law. The punishment is death. And what does Darius want to do? My sister Dorcas. Before you get to that point, what does he want to do? What does Darius want to do?
Okay, so then we was calling his God. Yeah, he has already signed the law and the law cannot be changed.
Why can't it be changed? Darius wrote the law, why can't he change it? But he is the king. Why can't he change his own law? Can't any mere mortal make a mistake? Can't he say to his people, I made a mistake? Then why doesn't he? My sister, why doesn't he? Darius is not seen as mortal by his people. This is why he can't change the law. Because to his people, Darius, king of Babylon, of Medo-Persia, Darius, he's not just a king. What else is he? He's deified. He's a type of God. So to his people, he has two hats. How many hats does Samuel have? Two hats. It's a theocracy. State power and religious power, incorporated into theocracy. Darius is the same. He's a king, but he's not just a king. He's also deified. He's the spiritual leader of Medo-Persia. So when he signs a decree as a god, saying you can't make requests, you can't pray and worship any other god except me because I'm a god, I'm your special god this month, you can't pray to anyone else. When he signs that decree as a god, then he comes back, he takes off his god hat and he puts on his king hat, and he comes back as a king and he wants to change the decree. Can he change it? No. Darius as king cannot change what he wrote into law as God. Is that clear to everyone, or is that confusing? So, when we see the history of ancient Israel, this is the true king of the north, yes? God's kingdom, the sides of Zion in the sides of the north. It's the true king of the north. And we talk about the counterfeit king of the north. So what type of system of government is Satan going to counterfeit? He sees a theocracy, church and state are incorporated into one person. He counterfeits that with Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. You get kings like Darius. They are church and state incorporated into one person. So I tricked you all when I said state or church. And Sister Dorcas chose to create a third option and say both, church and state. And I agree with her option. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, they're controlled by a church and state relationship, but who is over who? Church is over state. So Darius as God controls Darius as king. Does that make sense? So this is church state, this is church state. History of the cross, this changes, doesn't it? And now what does God do? He separates the church from the state in the history of Christ. Just to give it, I'll just call it 34 AD. Not meaning to be specific, but I want to make a point. So true King of the North, through the history from Moses to Christ, has this church-state model where they're incorporated into a theocracy. It's counterfeited with Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. Those ancient kingdoms are also a theocracy. Alexander the Great, he believed he was a god, didn't he? He believed he was a god, if we're not familiar with that history. That's why he named himself Alexander the Great. No historian called him Alexander the Great. That's the title he chose for himself. I think Daniel refers to it as Gadal. So then God separates church from state, and his people incorporated into this church. So if Satan works by counterfeiting, what does he have to do? Separate church from the state. When does that happen? Someone give me a date. If God did this in the history of Christ, what does Satan have to do to his kingdom? When does that happen? Someone raise your hand who wasn't here that Sabbath. My sister at the back, behind the tent. 1798? Do we all agree with that? Prior to 1798, we'll go back, we'll talk about, do you know the King Clovis of France? You know of Clovis? If he wants to get something done, whose permission does he need? For his people. For I think they were the Franks, weren't they? For his people. Is he a king and God? So Clovis, he's a king, yes? But he is not in the head of the religion of the people. Who's the head of their religion? My sister. The Pope. So can you see what's happened here? Darius is both king and God. You come down to Clovis and he's only king. So what has Satan then done? He's separated. So it must happen prior to 1798. Do you want to give us another date? Or I'll ask someone. My brother.
Could it be 3:30?
I'm going to say 3:30. Anyone else? My brother? 5:38. When does Satan counterfeit this? Separating church and state. When does he counterfeit that? Because you know that Darius, he's king and God. Come down to Clovis, he's only a king, he's got no religious leadership of his people. So you're saying in the 1260, the kings of Europe were a theocracy?
Yes, but at the end, we are going to see France separate from the authority of the church.
Yes?
So seeing the mark through when it begins the 17, forgotten the date, but when the French Revolution begins.
1789, yes? My brother?
Maybe the conversion of Constantine.
Conversion of Constantine. So you want to say, okay, that was the 533.
533.
We can mark this progressively. I don't want to be specific here or here. I'm just going to say 538. We can argue dates later. The point I want to make is we see that this is a counterfeit of this, yes? Then we see God do a work separating church from state. So by the time we come into the 1260 years, we have the papacy over who? The kings of Europe, but they're separated, aren't they? So God separated church and state. Satan separated counterfeit work of separating church and state. Now you don't have a theocracy where the king is also God. Now you have a pope, religious power, separate and distinct to the state power. Just as God's church, the early church of the disciples separated itself from the state power. Does that make sense? We're over time, but do we have any thoughts or questions before we close? We are over time. So we might leave it there. We'll come back and continue that discussion. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Thank you for how clear your lines are. They do not leave us in ignorance. I pray, Lord, that we will come into unity on these things. Please bless our day, bless our fellowship as we mingle and talk and study together. I pray that we'll have a right spirit and that we'll have unity on all of these points, that we can have one understanding when the time comes for us to do our work. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.